Hi, I'm Oliver Gao. I'm the director of System and Energy degree program here at Cornell. Today, we are very happy to have Chris Meyers, who is a senior research associate at Center for Advanced Computing at Cornell University, and also Chris is an adjunct professor with the Department of Physics and the Laboratory of Atomic and Solid State Physics at Cornell University. Chris' research lies at the intersection of physics, biology, computer science, and computational science, focused on problems such as biological information processing, structures and dynamics, and also a lot of other things which we'll hear more from Chris. So Chris, it's great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. So when I was looking at your career, I was so amazed. You started studying in history.
Right. I was an undergraduate history major and then kind of morphed in, but was interested in the history of science, and that was sort of a common theme throughout that, and I sort of morphed in that direction. Yeah.
So I think this is really, and this is probably a good point for us to start our systems conversation. It's interesting that actually before in our seminar series, we invited Fred Logman, who was a professor in history department.
Okay.
Actually, his talk, he was talking about Vietnam War.
Yep.
Actually, in my introduction to him, to the audience, in my view, I feel actually historians are actually the system engineer of humankind.
Right. Yep.
We're looking at how the dynamics change. So maybe, Chris, can you start by describing or talking about your career, how you evolved from a historian and all the way to this very complex systems engineer, and also it's computational.
Sure. Right. Right.
Thank you.
Sure. I can try to do that briefly. As I said, I was interested in sort of history and intellectual history, the history of ideas, and was certainly very interested in science as a field in its own right, but also sort of how that science was developed, throughout history. And I guess sort of a big turning point was learning about the development of essentially the beginning of dynamical systems theory that was invented by Henri Poincaré, the French mathematician, in the late 19th century, and this is sort of became the basis of what we now study in dynamical systems and chaos, and I was actually trying to write a senior history thesis on Poincaré's development of these ideas as applied to the three-body problem and other kinds of things. I was reading his mathematics texts in the French, and I was actually able to follow the French better than a lot of the mathematics. But I became and then I started studying dynamical systems in physics classes as well. Learning about this was a time when this was just becoming very popular, when chaos was becoming a very interesting subject that a lot of people were working on, and so I actually was doing research, sort of at that time in kind of simple dynamical systems models and trying to characterize chaotic behavior, but at the same time learning about this sort of the development of this historically, and I sort of realized that I really needed to understand the math and physics better, and decided to switch and sort of moved to go to graduate school in physics, and so, but I'd long been interested in sort of complexity and dynamics, and initially in kind of low dimensional systems, but then that has sort of grown, over the years into looking at systems with many degrees of freedom. So the kinds of problems we study in kind of statistical physics, looking at phase transitions and critical phenomena, pattern formation, kind of spatiotemporal patterning. And so that was sort of what I worked on kind of early in my career, in my graduate career, and as a postdoc, sort of morphed into working on problems in geophysics and material science, so looking at a lot of kind of structural and complexity in materials and response materials. And eventually, I don't know, it was about 15 or so years ago, I decided to sort of pivot towards biology. And one of the main motivations for doing that was that I'd long been interested in kind of complexity and dynamics, broadly defined, broadly interpreted, and long been interested in computation. I'd been spending a lot of time thinking about how to develop software to simulate complex systems, and I had an appointment in the Cornell Theory Center and was very engaged in a lot of sort of sort of computational science and software development. And I realized that what biological systems bring are the ability of complex systems to carry out very complex computations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, normally when we think of biological information processing, we think of the brain, we think of those kinds of computations. But even at the level of individual cells, of networks, of biochemical networks in cells that are regulating gene expression or responding to extracellular signals or regulating metabolism and development and things, that these are all very sophisticated computations that are carried out in sort of biomolecular hardware. And I was interested in sort of what the logic of that process looks like. And so that was sort of how I sort of made the shift into biology, trying to understand how complex systems compute. And in fact, some of the early work that I did kind of moving into that field was only peripherally about biology, but was sort of looking at how large software systems are organized and trying to sort of see connections between the way we organize complex systems in building functionality in software and the way that biological systems are organized to be both, to carry out lots of different kinds of functions, but also to be very robust and evolvable. I mean, this is sort of what distinguishes our man-made engineered systems from evolved living systems, is that they are just so much more robust to all sorts of insults than we have yet figured out how to engineer into most of the things that we build as humans, either whether it be software or hardware. And that's sort of been a kind of a recurring theme. But at the same time, I've worked in very sort of concrete and specific kinds of biological problems there's a number of wonderful collaborators here at Cornell and elsewhere who have taught me a lot of biology, to sort of try to tackle, apply some of the ideas and techniques that I bring from physics to the study of biological phenomena.
While you are talking, I kind of wrote down like 3 key words: dynamics, complexity, and computation. So even though history sounds having very little to do with engineering, and then when we talk about this biosystems and also this kind of disease, and even at the very individual cell level, but it seems like dynamics and complexity are the common phenomena that exist both in history and exist at this individual cell level.
Sure. I mean, they exist everywhere. They exist and I think as engineering moves from maybe more working on more focused products to systems in the large, I think systems engineering is going to be confronting and the kinds of phenomena that we've been studying for a long time, for example, in physics. I mean, so one of the things that I tried to bring to these lectures that I developed for the Foundations of Complex Systems course was to try to bring some of the insights that we've learned in physics about the way we see phase transitions in systems of many degrees of freedom, and sort of what kinds of things drive those, and partly to try to plant it in the students' minds that they should expect to see these kinds of phenomena in the engineered systems that they study, right?
I see.
I guess one of the things you work on is transportation, right?
Yeah.
And of course, traffic jams are a classic type of phase transition that
That's
I'm sure
right.
engineers deal with on a daily basis. But at the same time, this is jamming in granular materials is something that's of enormous interest in kind of the condensed matter physics and kind of soft matter community now, trying to understand really the foundations of the dynamics and the critical phenomena, the phase transitions that underlie those kinds of phenomena, and which may eventually. And I mean, physicists have historically worked on simple models of traffic jams. I don't know if they've done anything that actually impacts the way the traffic is designed, but I mean, I think it is important for students in systems engineering not just to sort of learn the engineering perspective on this, but to understand what it is that's been recognized in terms of the dynamics of complex systems, kind of more broadly defined.
I see.
And then I guess just the other side of that, I mean, sort of the other piece that I tried to bring to these lectures was some insight from biology, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that I think there are things both from physics and biology that can help inform students in systems engineering to think about how systems can be organized. Maybe biology provides very different modalities for how systems are organized, and they are evolved. They are kind of self-assembled rather than things that we assemble ourselves. And so I think it's important for students in a PhD program like this to understand sort of that landscape more broadly.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and even not only for PhD students, for anyone, like in our daily life, right? How we view the world, right? Combining these system views are very important.
Well, even like this thing that I'll be talking about today, infectious disease dynamics, is something that we're constantly confronted with in the news on a daily basis, and and one of the reasons that this is a challenging field is, of course, evolution constantly is driving new. There's always new pathogens and new things to worry about, new strains of things because of evolution. But of course, there are people out there in the world who don't want to admit that evolution is actually taking place. But we see it on a daily basis when we have a new flu vaccine like this year that doesn't work very well. And we're seeing increased outbreaks in influenza, right?
So now I see the deep root where you started this kind of system. Even when you were studying history, actually you're already looking at the system dynamics. You mentioned the system dynamics like with these kind of three-body studies, and now you are looking at the system dynamics either infectious disease or the cell structures.
So in what would be called systems biology.
System biology. So what do you see as some kind of the common guiding principles under systems science or system approach that you see the connection of system dynamics in history and system biology?
Okay, you want me to connect these two very broad, the history and biology. I guess I haven't thought much about systems dynamics in history. I sort of got into the field by thinking about history. Well, again, as I said, I think there are generic kinds of phenomena that we see in lots of different systems, like pattern formation, like phase transitions, and part of what physics has kind of focused on is trying to really understand why those phenomena are so generic and so universal. And in fact, there are very deep kind of theoretical ideas, and most important of which is the idea of the renormalization group that was invented here at Cornell by Ken Wilson in the physics department many years ago, along with others. But which so I guess that's sort of the point is that it's I think that there are common features in widely different systems that we can learn from, and it's important to again be aware of those and try to figure out where they might apply. Not necessarily everything is going to apply from one field to another, but I think there are common features that we see in not just physical systems, but in biological systems and social systems. We see the polarization of the electorate, and that has in some ways, and that has connections to things like development of magnetization and magnets. And people have even applied models, that were originally developed to describe magnetization and magnets to describe polarization in the electorate in this country. So I think, sort of being broadly aware of those kinds of phenomena. And I guess the other thing is sort of not being afraid to kind of to start by looking at simple models, even if you recognize that those simple models aren't describing every last detail of whatever particular system that you're interested in. That's kind of a common theme throughout a lot of this work generally, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very key point. For system research or system thinking, one key thing is really scale and the resolution of granularity. Right? So while the system dynamics history, it is at certain scale, while system biology is at another kind of
but the same, right? Obviously, when we talk about complex systems, we're talking about many degrees of freedom that are interacting in non-trivial ways. But those degrees of freedom can be molecules in a cell, or they can be people, or even groups within a society. That it sort of you do that kind of coarse graining, but then you try to understand what happens on among the interactions of those elements, right?
Yeah. So if we take a system approach, when we look at individual cell, or even when we look at system biology, right? Everything, all the dynamics that can be explained
Right.
and simulated following the physical, engineering, and biology principles.
Right.
You can predict, right? But then when we raise the scale a little bit, when we go from system biology from individual cell or from an individual person to a family and to a community, and of course to the whole history, you can see that the system complexity comes in. Do you think that actually the social factors comes together with the increase of the scale? Because when you increase the scale or the range or the domain of the problem, and there is this interaction, like the social factors actually happen when there are interactions, when there are.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and I think at whatever scale you're building a model, you need to bring, expertise and insight into what those components are and what those interactions are. I mean, I wouldn't ever purport to be able to start from, the systems biology of the cell and use that to build up to a model of human society. I mean, so you'd want to build a model, but you'd want to bring in, experts who know how to characterize those kinds of systems. But at the same time, there may not be as much in the way of sort of, quantitative descriptions that have been developed in those kinds of, social systems, for example. But even, for example, like in the context of infectious disease dynamics, one of the things that is, has been happening recently is that as we get a lot more information about the structure of social interactions, I mean, there's huge amounts of work, characterizing the structure of social networks based on data sets that have become available in recent years and the like. And that structure is rather different than what was sort of originally envisioned when people started building kind of simpler models of infectious diseases in populations. And so there's been a lot of recent activity trying to figure out how to build in the heterogeneity that we learn about, by studying social networks and understanding that some people have relatively small number of contacts, but a few people have lots of contacts out in the world, and they can actually be very important in spreading infection in a population. And so I mean, essentially what we're doing is we're kind of drilling down where we have information about how to sort of build a model. I mean, in some ways, this is sort of what happened in material science, started going back, at least 20 years ago. I mean, work that I was involved in with people, in your department with Tony Ingraffia and others, Paul Dawson and Matt Miller. I mean, we were very interested in describing the structure and response of material failure, plasticity, fracture, and the sort of the models that were commonly used were all kind of continuum models where they were trying to figure out how to bundle in all of this sort of small scale microstructure and even atomistic scale structure into kind of phenomenological effective models at a continuum scale. And there was a lot of interest in, as we get more information about microstructure, about what those degrees of freedom look like and how they interact, we can build models that explicitly take that information into account. So I guess it's I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I guess you need to. There's no magic bullet to build. I mean, and I suspect that in fact it probably is a harder problem in building accurate models in the realm of social dynamics, just because the underlying elements are so much more complicated. But
yeah, you're right. And kind of this kind of while you were talking, I was thinking. Imagine even the human body, right? That consists of billions of cells.
Yep.
Right. These cells actually they are living in the community. They're interconnected.
Yep.
They're in the community of our our body. So they also have interactions.
And not just with our own body, but with all the
external
the
environment.
we have more microbial cells in our body than we have human cells in our body. So there's a huge that we are partners with our microbes that's that's increasingly recognized as an important element of what is needed to describe, for example, human physiology. Sorry, but I interrupted.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
I think, so in that case, and you mentioned also in the social factors. So now if you look at system biology and then history, and then if you think, so what has really been driving our human history? And what is the role? Of course, we have the system biology, which is the very fundamental physical factors.
Right. Although I guess I would disagree with the premise that you raised a few minutes ago that we can actually, at that scale, predict things very well. I mean, in fact, this is a major challenge in systems biology, even though we have a lot of information about which proteins are interacting and which genes are being expressed and which metabolites are being synthesized. That is still a very incomplete understanding. I mean, we cannot predict even at the level of a single cell everything that's going on, and partly that's because again we only have partial information. There are lots of processes that we know happen, but we don't know exactly how they happen or how fast they happen, and a lot of the details of that dynamical system depend upon that kind of quantitative information. And I mean, so one of the things that I've been working on, and this is mostly with Jim Sethna in physics, but with a lot of other very excellent students who've kind of come through over the years, is something we call sloppy models, which is how to build predictive models of complex systems when we only have kind of partial information about things like rate constants or other parameters in these kind of biochemical processes. And one of the kind of things that saves us in that regard is that even though we might have a cell or even a subsystem in a cell with many, hundreds of degrees of freedom, lots of different parameters and lots of different proteins that are doing this very complicated dance, that the dynamics actually ends up often lying on some much lower dimensional manifold, that there's a smaller subsystem that is embedded within there that is actually driving, sort of the full dynamics of the system. And in fact, some of the methods that we've been developing sort of under this guise of sloppy models are aimed at trying to understand that the shapes of and the sensitivities of those manifolds, so that we could in fact try to come up with reduced descriptions, which is sort of it's kind of a similar theme if you look at big data and machine learning, which is a very hot topic. I mean, a lot of the methods that people are interested in trying to develop are basically trying to find lower dimensional patterns in data. That's sort of from a black box approach. Just take the data and let's try to use tools, for example, for machine learning to look for lower dimensional subsystems that describe those patterns. In systems biology, there's sort of a push from the bottom up where we're building kind of mechanistic models, and we're trying to understand those kinds of sensitivities. So there's still, all I'm saying is that even at that scale, there's a huge amount of research that's involved in trying to figure out how to build useful and predictive models from the information we have. But what's really driving that, to some extent, is the fact that we have all of this data on what the individual components in what the genes are doing, what the proteins are doing. And part of the challenge is to figure out how to build useful models given the information we have without being able to measure absolutely everything that's required.
So on one hand, like now today we're enjoying on the transportation side, like kind of you can fly from New York City to China 13 hours.
Yeah.
And our world is becoming
has shrunk. Yeah.
More connected.
Right.
So what's your view, this increasingly connected world versus the vulnerability, resilience, and also sensibility of human species? I mean,
it certainly makes it seems like it makes the infectious disease problem much more difficult, right? Because now all of these, these movies that we see on TV of infectious diseases spreading, something starts somewhere or another, some other part of the world, and the next day, as you say, you fly from New York to China, and it's, you've transported whatever pathogens you might have, right? So certainly it introduces real challenges in that regard. In fact, I mean, going back to the history, if we can, I mean, that this has sort of been recognized for a long time. So there's a sort of a famous story that I remember reading about where I forget exactly what the disease was, but essentially there were workers from India who were being transported to work in Australia. This was back in the 19th century, and and originally they would travel by sailing ships that would take many weeks to execute, or maybe even months to execute that voyage. And there was some infectious disease that was endemic in India, and so some fraction of the people who got on that ship to go to Australia were infected, but that basically that infection would burn out, on the ship by the time they got to Australia, there was no active infection. I mean, many people unfortunately had died during that process, but there was never any transmission because of that long time scale. And then when steamships were introduced, that voyage got reduced to a matter of a few weeks, and all of a sudden there was this massive flow of infection from India to Australia, because of the fact that once people got off the ship in Australia, they were infected, and they were able to introduce it into that population. So now where you're talking about, flying across the planet in half a day, I mean, that's shrinking things even further. I mean, at some point, right, there's no separation there, right? So in terms of vulnerability, we certainly are much more vulnerable, and so we need to be much more vigilant. We need to develop better sort of diagnostics. We certainly need to develop better vaccines. I don't really work in that area, but apparently sort of the state of vaccine development is really pretty poor. I mean, in this worldwide, really. I mean, for not a lot of important diseases. There was just an op-ed in the New York Times a few weeks ago saying we're not ready for an influenza pandemic, and basically because there really has not, one of the take-home messages was there has not been really sufficient attention paid to developing really robust vaccines that don't need to be tweaked every year like we currently do. So it certainly requires additional effort on many fronts. It is a complex problem, which is sort of part of one of the themes of the seminar I'll give, is that infectious diseases are sort of complex problems at many different scales, but at the same time, this then gives an opportunity for people with lots of different kinds of expertise to contribute to the study of that, including people who work on transportation systems, right?
Yeah, that's true. So in that case, kind of, in everything, whenever look at things from a system perspective, everything, they have the drawback and also the good side. So from a system dynamics point of view, you've been doing system dynamics research. Right. Looking at this infectious disease, and also there is a benefit of getting better connected. So maybe, I don't know if there is an answer to my question. However, what do you think half connected is good?
Sorry, you're saying there are benefits to being better connected in the sense that we have increased trade opportunities and education,
right,
or whatever, right? Sure, there are reasons that we don't go travel across the world just because we want to spread diseases, right? It's just,
is there any sweet spot? For example, recently I was this is kind of just physical connection.
Sure. So one example is, for example, that springs to mind is in the realm of plant diseases, and of course much of agriculture is dominated by large swaths of monoculture of sort of identical strains or varieties of crops that are all then susceptible to the same infection, right? And so this is sort of a common refrain that we hear is that kind of, so that's sort of a connectivity in a different sense, in the sense that the economics of big agriculture is driving people to develop these very large scale monocultures, but then that leaves us very more vulnerable to very severe plant disease outbreaks. And so some people will argue, well, we need to break up that monoculture either with different varieties or by planting, introducing different cropping patterns or what have you. I mean, there's a number of people who kind of work in that area who are trying to figure out ways of making that system less connected, in the sense that you can have one big disease outbreak that impacts and I think you see similar kinds of things, for example, in I've been thinking a little bit about wildfires out in California. We've been hearing about a lot of them in the news, and it seems like sometimes it's the intersection of the development impacts what the natural resources then are able to. We see that in wildfires in California, we see it in floods in Texas, that sort of this rampant development without much thinking about how that development couples to natural processes like fires or floods makes things worse, right? And so I think in that sense, I mean, that is an important area where, it sort of gets to your question of how connected is too much. I mean, if you pave over the entire Houston metropolitan area, then you should expect there to be large floods, right? And so you need to think about how to engineer a system like that more intelligently to accommodate the fact that there will be natural processes that don't pay much attention to your development goals, right?
So in that sense, if I can summarize, so I was thinking, so which means that increased connection, of course, coming together with increased connection, there is increased complexity, which means the connection and complexity themselves are not bad things. Actually, they can be good things. It's really kind of whether like
and you
human
can use
beings
that complexity for control. I mean,
that's right.
Yeah. Right.
So whether we can, whether humans we are smart, intelligent, and wise enough to take full advantage of the good side of connection and then try to control the downside. And in that sense, do human beings as a whole have a goal in the development?
Well, I mean, they have many goals. It's a multi-objective function. There are short-term goals of maximizing, maximizing profit, and long-term goals of ensuring the sustainability of the Earth, right? I mean, and sometimes those goals don't always align with each other, I guess, right? But
yeah, that's right.
I think this. I guess I see this as an important area where systems engineering can. This is an area where systems engineering can play an important role by really, trying to help identify those kinds of trade-offs and propose solutions that again, sometimes there are trade-offs, but sometimes there are things that we think are trade-offs, may not really be so. So, for example, the development of sort of tension between economic development and environmental concerns, right? I mean, traditionally we've been told that there's sort of this trade-off between those, and they can't coexist. But of course, if you develop economic, efforts that are trying to sustain the environment rather than sort of work against it, then there are opportunities there as well with renewable energy or whatever else you might be. And so I think in these other areas in flood control, in infectious diseases, whatever. I mean, yes, we have a more connected and complicated world, and we need to bring to bear control strategies. And again, control is something that engineering is that's always a constant theme in engineering, whereas it might not be in some fields. We tend to study more sort of nature as it exists rather than trying to figure out how to corral it for some goal, right? And I think that's an important thing that systems engineering can kind of bring broadly to these kinds of problems.
Yeah, of course, only if we're controlling in the right direction. Like in our control problem definition, we have the right objective function.
Right.
Otherwise, we could be doing things wrong. So I think we're probably running out of time. But I want to come back to we've been admitting graduate students to system engineering. For example, there are some students saying, "Oh, I had a background in social studies, and I have been my undergrad major in economics. Do you think if I can, satisfy the system engineering requirement?" And here you are a wonderful example, with a history background. So what would you say? How did you manage yourself to evolve, from a history major, and to physics? And even mathematics and computation. What would you say to these future system students?
Partly it's because I didn't choose to put myself in a box, right? I mean, I was a history major, but I was also very interested in physics and mathematics, and so I took those courses, and I didn't care that they didn't fit into some notion of what my curriculum should be. That was just what I was interested in, and I kind of followed my interests where they've gone. So I think that's an important thing, is just sort of be aware of your interests and don't but at the same time, one of the reasons that I became a history major was that I was very interested in the material, But also I found that there was a challenge when I got to college that this, and I think this is a problem generally in the sciences, is that you kind of have to get on a track from day one, right? You kind of have to, that there's a progression of courses. There's a sequence of courses, and when I got to college, I just wasn't. I mean, I took some math and astronomy courses, but for example, with regard to physics, I wasn't ready to step on that track. I was having fun learning about other things, and so I actually started that track 2 years late. I mean, literally, I started taking freshman physics in my junior year of college. But partly it was because I didn't, so I think there needs to be somehow in the long term, if we want to try to have people who are both, kind of quantitatively trained in the sciences and mathematics, but that also have connections to these other fields, to give them better kind of curricular flexibility so that they can, that it's not just all that one, that one track that everyone has to fill, right? I mean, in my case, I started that track, like I said, 2 years late. And then I graduated after 4 years with a history degree, and actually came back and I spent an extra year partly doing research, but also partly kind of cramming in the last 2 years of an undergraduate physics major into 1 year, and then using that, so. But I guess sort of broadly, I think that the answer is, like I said, it's not. I mean, I remember I used to have. Conversation. I mean, I was just willing to talk to anybody about anything, without sort of sort of constraints as to, well, I don't study that stuff, so therefore I'm not qualified. I think showing a lot of curiosity and flexibility is important for students, especially in an area like this where they might be have a variety of interests and want to try to bring different skills. I mean, I think it is important if somebody is coming into the program without necessarily the right quantitative skills, then there needs to be an opportunity and a mechanism for them to continue to develop those.
Yeah, I think I really like when you first started answer my question. The first sentence you said, "Don't put yourself in a box."
Right.
And I think that's really hit the nail. I think it's really kind of don't limit yourself.
Right. No, and I've never put myself in a box. I've tended to fall through lots of cracks as a result. But at the same time, I've gotten to work on lots of interesting things that that I've been interested in. So
I see.
Yeah.
What would be your suggestions for us, to cope with this infectious disease? From your research, what are your major
again, I mean, the questions are really trying, again, sort of as I was alluding to before, trying to understand dynamics, is sort of with, more richly in terms of, bringing in more complexity in terms of the structure of populations or the structure of landscapes or interactions between populations. So it's really trying to just understand some of that complexity, as opposed to trying to sort of control some particular any particular disease. Although again, one of the take-home messages is, as I suggested before, is that it's often very useful to kind of start with simple models and understand what's going on there in a lot of detail before you start to build a more complicated model of some specific system. So one of the things that I'm going to talk some about is these kinds of infections that we were talking about that jump from animal to human populations, which are sort of the drivers for most of the nasty stuff that we I mean, most of the things that we worry about as humans in the area of infectious disease actually started in animal populations, and then they spill over. They've spilled over into human populations. Some really take hold in human populations, and some kind of don't. But there's been lots and lots of efforts to build models of particular diseases, but not really sort of understanding this basic sort of process of spillover and what drives that. And so I mean, sometimes it's useful to just build and they're often kind of called toy models, and sometimes toy models are just useful in that they help orient you to kind of the phenomenology of some problem, so then you can figure out how do you sort of understand that first, and then you can try to figure out, well, what additional levels of detail or complexity or realism might be useful to layer on top of that to describe some particular system of interest.
Yeah, taking a progressive approach
Right,
Yeah.
but sometimes toy models are actually quantitatively correct if they're describing something like a phase transition and looking at scaling exponents which is something we study in physics, and so toy model are often thought of as just being, they're sort of qualitative, they give you some insight, but sometimes they can actually go further than that, and I think that's sort of one of the take-home messages too. I mean, so that we can bring ideas and techniques from other fields to this very important kind of biological problem of infectious disease dynamics, and then sort of use not just the techniques, but some of the sort of the mindset that has been developed as well to think about how to do the modeling and how to build models that connect across scales. And again, this is something that I did a long time ago in the realm of materials modeling, and now we're trying to think about how to do that in the realm of sort of population scale infectious disease modeling. But that's sort of a recurring theme through a lot of this too, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's how somehow probably, I think, right, kind of, complexity has to be addressed by starting simple.
Right.
Right, I think
Right.
that way we can.
Yep.
Yeah, that's kind
right. And there's always a temptation to just dive in and build. Well, I know there's all this stuff going on. Of course, I have to build a model that has all those pieces in it. And part of the sort of the art of modeling is figuring out which pieces are important to include and which pieces maybe don't. You don't need to build into the very first model that you put together, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And also in that case, probably the major difficulty is not about embracing the complexity. The major difficulty is actually simplifying things wisely.
And the wisely is partly a challenge, because especially if you're moving into some different field where you haven't been trained, you need to learn. You need to learn enough of the biology to know what things might or might not be important, right?
That's right.
But of course, that's not necessarily all on you. This is why it's important to work with collaborators who are, experts in particular domains. And so I think, I think it's also important for students in your program to sort of have an interdisciplinary, spirit, but also, a collaborative spirit, right? That it's important to be able to know when to ask, for help if you're trying to build a model of something that you don't really understand, right?
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.